Spring of 1122, Anno Domini. The sun rose over the Balkan plains near the city of Beroia, in what we now call Bulgaria, casting long shadows across an impossible scene. Tens of thousands of Pecheneg horsemen, nomadic warriors from the endless Russian steppes, had crossed the frozen Danube weeks earlier and now stood arrayed in their traditional defensive formation. A massive circle of wagons, chained together, stretched across the landscape like a wooden fortress. From behind this laager, horse archers could rain arrows on any attacker, retreat to safety, and surge forward for devastating cavalry charges. The Pechenegs had used this tactic for generations, and it had never failed them. But they were about to face something they had never encountered before, something that would end their people's existence as an independent nation. Not Byzantine cavalry, not Greek fire, but giant axes in the hands of men from the frozen north. Constantinople, 3 months earlier, winter 1121. In the great palace overlooking the Bosphorus, Emperor John II Komnenos received the worst possible news. The Pechenegs were coming. Again. His father, the legendary Alexios I, had crushed these same nomads at the Battle of Lavunion in 1091, killing so many that chroniclers said the plains ran red for days. The survivors had been enrolled in the Byzantine army, their warriors scattered across the empire as soldiers. But not all Pechenegs had been at Lavunion. Some bands had remained on the steppes beyond imperial reach. In 1094, the Cumans, rivals from even further east, had attacked them. Many died, many were absorbed, but some survived, maintaining their independence, nursing their grievances, waiting for their moment. That moment had come. Vladimir Monomakh, the Prince of Kiev, had a problem. The Pechenegs dwelling along his southern borders were becoming troublesome. According to some Byzantine historians, Vladimir may have quietly encouraged them to move elsewhere. Somewhere that wasn't his problem. Like Byzantine Thrace, whether through conspiracy or coincidence, in the winter of 1121, the remaining Pechenegs packed their lives onto wagons, gathered their herds, armed their warriors, and began moving south. By early 1122, they'd crossed the Danube, the traditional boundary between the steppes and Byzantine civilization. They weren't raiding, they were invading, an entire people, desperate and dangerous, flooding into the richest provinces of the empire, the kind of threat that could destabilize an entire frontier. John Komnenos was 35 years old. He had been emperor for only 4 years, having succeeded his father in 1118. Chroniclers called him John the Beautiful, not for vanity but for the nobility of his character. He was pious, dedicated, personally brave. He had already campaigned successfully against the Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor, securing Byzantine control over the southwestern regions. But now he faced a crisis in Europe that demanded immediate attention. The emperor made his decision quickly. The army campaigning in Anatolia would be recalled. Every available soldier would march north. The Pechenegs would be met in the field and destroyed. Not contained, not negotiated with, destroyed. Because John understood what his advisors understood. If these nomads established themselves in Thrace, if they created a permanent foothold in the Balkans, the empire would face decades of raiding, instability, and slow bleeding along its most vital frontier. The Byzantine field army assembled outside the great walls of Constantinople was a formidable force. It represented the culmination of reforms begun by John's father, a professional military machine that could rival anything in the medieval world. At its core were the tagmata, elite units stationed in the capital, heavy cavalry called cataphracts, armoured in lamellar plates that could turn aside arrows and sword strikes, infantry units equipped with spears called contarians, varying in length depending on their tactical role, archers, both foot and mounted, engineers who could construct siege equipment in the field, and at the very centre of this army, positioned closest to the emperor himself, stood the Varangian Guard, the Varangians, the axe-bearing barbarians, the Pelekiphoroi, mercenaries from the frozen lands beyond the known world who had served Byzantine emperors for over a century. To understand what made them so terrifying, you need to understand where they came from and what they represented. The story of the Varangian Guard began in 988, when the Byzantine Emperor Basil II faced a rebellion that threatened to overthrow him. Desperate, he reached out to Vladimir I, Grand Prince of Kiev, for military assistance. Vladimir agreed, but he demanded a high price. The emperor's sister Anna in marriage confirmation of his royal status and Byzantine support for his conversion to Christianity. In exchange, Vladimir would send 6,000 warriors. These weren't just any soldiers, they were Rus warriors, themselves descended from Scandinavian Vikings who had established kingdoms along the river routes of Eastern Europe. Men who knew nothing of Byzantine politics, who had no loyalty to any Byzantine faction, who could be counted upon absolutely to protect the emperor because the emperor paid them in gold. When these 6,000 arrived in Constantinople in 987, Basil II took one look at them and understood he had found something precious. These northern warriors, towering over Mediterranean men, armed with weapons that looked like agricultural implements but could split a man from shoulder to waist. They became his personal bodyguard, the core of the Varangian Guard. Over the decades, the Guard's composition evolved. After William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, thousands of displaced Anglo-Saxon nobles and warriors, unwilling to submit to Norman rule, made their way to Constantinople. They had heard the stories. A city so wealthy its streets were paved with precious stones, according to Norse sagas. An emperor who paid his guards in gold. Service in foreign lands where their axes would be respected and feared. By 1122, the Varangian Guard was roughly half Scandinavian, half Anglo-Saxon. Norse and Old English mixed in their ranks, but they shared crucial characteristics. The warrior culture of the North, absolute loyalty to their oath, and a preference for the weapon that defined them, the Danish axe. The Dane axe, also called the long axe or hafted axe, was unlike anything used by Mediterranean armies. Picture a weapon with a shaft between 4 and 6 feet long, sometimes longer. At the end, a blade of forged steel, thin but incredibly wide, with pronounced horns at toe and heel. The cutting edge could span nearly a foot. This was a two-handed weapon that required strength, skill, and absolute commitment. When swung by a trained warrior, it could cleave through shields, sever limbs, split armour, and kill horses with a single blow. The Bayeux Tapestry, created around the time of Hastings in 1066, shows Anglo-Saxon hussars wielding these axes, depicting one warrior splitting a Norman knight's horse's head completely in half. One surviving ivory plaque from 10th century Constantinople shows a Varangian holding an axe as tall as its wielder. These weren't ceremonial weapons, they were instruments of controlled violence. But their psychological impact was perhaps even greater than their physical effectiveness. The sight of a line of heavily armoured warriors, each holding an axe that towered over them, advancing in formation, created a spectacle of terror. The sound was distinctive, a deep, thundering approach. Ancient accounts describe it as a roar that could be heard from miles away. When the Varangians went into battle, everyone knew, friend and enemy alike. By 1122, the Varangian Guard had participated in countless campaigns. They had fought in southern Italy against Normans and Lombards. They had been present at the disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where most of the emperor's guards died around him. They had defended Constantinople during sieges, suppressed revolts, and accompanied emperors on campaign. They were the empire's elite shock troops, deployed at critical moments when battles hung in the balance. But they had never faced an enemy quite like the Pechenegs, and the Pechenegs had certainly never faced anything like them. The Byzantine army marched north from Constantinople in early spring 1122. John Komnenos rode at its head, personally leading the expedition. This was not unusual. Byzantine emperors of the Komnenian dynasty were expected to lead from the front. John's father, Alexios, had spent most of his reign on campaign. John himself would conduct approximately 25 sieges during his 25-year rule. The emperor was not merely a political figure. He was the supreme military commander, and his presence inspired the troops. The Varangians marched close to the emperor, as was their privilege and duty. They travelled on foot, as was their custom. Vikings and Anglo-Saxons both used horses for strategic mobility, but fought as infantry, heavy infantry, armoured in the best equipment Byzantine workshops could produce. Lamellar armour, scale mail, ring mail, kite shields similar to those used by other Byzantine units, though some still carried the traditional round shields of their homelands, helmets of various designs, secondary weapons, swords, both Byzantine and northern, but always the axes. Meanwhile, the Pechenegs had crossed the Haemus Mountains, also called the Balkan Mountains, and descended into Thrace. They established themselves near Beroia, modern Stara Zagora. Chronicler Niketas Choniets, writing decades later, called what followed one of the most frightful and terrifying battles ever fought. That's a remarkable statement from someone documenting an empire that had fought for over 700 years. When the Byzantine army arrived and made contact with the Pecheneg forces, John initially attempted negotiation, not because he wanted peace, but because he wanted advantage. The emperor sent envoys who spoke the Pecheneg language, bearing gifts, offering to negotiate a treaty favourable to the nomads' interests. The Pecheneg chiefs, perhaps remembering that Basil II had once settled previous invaders peacefully within imperial borders, entered negotiations. They believed they held the stronger position. They had superior numbers. They had mobility. They had their traditional tactics. And they had their lega, their wagon fortress, which had never been breached by any enemy. While the Pechenegs debated terms, John positioned his army. The Byzantines deployed in traditional formation, heavy infantry phalanx at the centre, cavalry wings on the flanks to counter the enemy's mounted archers, the Varangian Guard positioned near the emperor, held in reserve for the critical moment. Then, without warning, John attacked. The diplomatic envoys had been a deception. The gifts had been a distraction. The negotiations had been a stratagem to keep the enemy commanders focused on something other than the approaching army. It worked. The Byzantine assault caught the Pechenegs unprepared. But these were not soft merchants or farming peasants. These were steppe warriors who had spent lifetimes in the saddle, who had learned to shoot arrows while riding at full gallop, who had survived countless tribal wars. They reacted with practiced efficiency. The Pechenegs fought as they had always fought, as waves of horse archers, mounted warriors would sweep forward, release volleys of arrows at ranges where Byzantine infantry couldn't respond, then wheel away before contact. Then another wave, and another. The arrows fell like rain. Chronicler Niketas Choniets recorded that the Pechenegs fought with cavalry charges, discharges of missiles, and war, cries that shook the plain. The Byzantine army advanced steadily under this punishment. This was what they trained for: discipline, formation, mutual support, shields raised to deflect arrows, heavy armour absorbing hits that would have killed unarmoured men. Step by step the Byzantine infantry pushed forward. John himself was active throughout, riding among his troops with his bodyguards, providing assistance to beleaguered units, directing reinforcements, maintaining cohesion. In the chaos of battle, an arrow struck the emperor in the leg. He stayed in the saddle. The wound was painful but not critical. The troops could see their emperor, wounded, still commanding. It inspired them. The Byzantines forced the Pechenegs backward. The nomads, realizing they couldn't stop the Byzantine advance through archery alone, made the decision that had saved them countless times before. They fell back to their lager, the wagon fortress. The circle of wagons, chained together, formed a massive defensive perimeter. Estimates suggest the Pecheneg camp contained tens of thousands of people, not just warriors. This was an entire migrating nation, families, children, herds, all protected within that circle. From behind the wagons, Pecheneg archers could fire with relative safety. The wagons blocked cavalry charges. Infantry attempting to climb over them would be cut down by arrows or speared by warriors. The wagons also served as ammunition depots, with stocks of arrows readily available. Pecheneg cavalry could sally out through gaps, deliver attacks, then retreat to safety. It was a nearly perfect defensive position. The Byzantine army reached the lega and stopped. They had to. Charging directly at a fortified position with unlimited ammunition would be suicide. Byzantine infantry formed lines just beyond arrow range, maintaining pressure, preventing the Pechenegs from emerging freely. But they couldn't advance. The battle reached stalemate. This is the moment chronicled in Byzantine sources, the moment when leadership mattered most. John Komnenos, Emperor of the Romans, wounded in the leg by a Pecheneg arrow, surrounded by his commanders and bodyguards, studied the situation. His army was winning but couldn't finish the fight. The Pechenegs were trapped but safe. The stalemate could continue for days. His soldiers would slowly bleed from arrow fire. The Pechenegs had food, water, and effectively unlimited arrows. Time favoured the nomads. Something had to break the wagon wall. According to Niketas Choniets, John devised a cunning plan. The chronicler notes that John was not only valiant and a cunning tactician by nature, but he was also the first to execute the instructions he gave his generals and soldiers. The emperor looked upon an icon of the Theotokos, the Mother of God, seeking wisdom from his protector. Then he made his decision. He called for the Varangians. The Varangian Guard had been held in reserve throughout the battle. Standard Byzantine. Tactical doctrine. Elite shock troops weren't wasted on preliminary actions. They were deployed at critical moments, where their impact would be decisive. This was that moment. The sources describe what happened next. John, taking with him his bodyguards who were armed with long shields and single-edged axes, went forth like an unbreakable wall to meet the Pechenegs, like an unbreakable wall. That's how a Byzantine chronicler described the Varangian Guard advancing, not like soldiers, like a natural force. The Varangians moved toward the wagon lager. These were men who had trained together for years, who knew each other's movements, who had developed the specific techniques required to fight as heavy infantry with two-handed weapons. They advanced in formation, shields raised, axes ready. The Pechenegs saw them coming and intensified their arrow fire. Every archer in the Lega who had a clear shot began loosing arrows at these advancing northern giants. The arrows struck armour, shields, helmets. Some found gaps, some Varangians fell, but the formation didn't break. One of the characteristics that made the Varangian Guard so effective was their armour. The Byzantines equipped them with the best protection available. Lamella armour, layers of small plates laced together, could distribute the impact of arrows across multiple plates. Scale mail, with overlapping metal scales, provided similar protection. Ring mail offered flexibility with decent defence. The Varangians' shields, though primarily designed for close combat, could deflect arrows if properly angled. Byzantine military doctrine emphasized combined arms and mutual support. The Varangians weren't advancing alone. Regular Byzantine infantry moved with them, providing covering shields, taking some of the arrow fire, creating a moving wall of protection. The Guard was the spearhead, the point of maximum force, but they were supported by the larger army. They reached the wagon circle. This is where the Danish axe proved its value in a way no other weapon could match. Imagine the problem. You're a Byzantine soldier facing a wall of wooden wagons chained together, with warriors behind them shooting arrows and thrusting spears. You can't easily climb over because you'll be killed at the top. You can't push them apart because they're chained. You need to break through. A sword won't do it. Swords are designed to cut flesh and bone, not wood. A spear is useless. You need something that can destroy wood with massive force. An axe with a 6-foot handle swung by a strong man using both hands and his full body weight. That's a tool that can split wood, heavy wood, thick wood. The Varangians began hacking at the wagons. The sources are explicit. They hacked their way through the enemy's circle of wagons. They didn't go over. They didn't go around. They went through, with axes. The sound must have been tremendous. Wood splintering, metal crashing against metal as axe blades bit into iron wagon. Fittings. Varangians shouting in Norse and Old English. Pechenegs screaming in their Turkic language. The clash of close combat as defenders tried desperately to stop the breach. The Pechenegs fought back with everything they had. Hand-to-hand combat. Spears thrust between wagon gaps. Arrows at point-blank range. But the Varangian Guard had one advantage that overrode everything else. The Dane axe wasn't just a tool for breaking wood. It was arguably the most devastating close-quarters weapon of the medieval period. When a Varangian swung his axe in a full arc, the momentum of the long handle combined with the weight of the blade created terrifying force. Contemporary accounts from other battles describe these axes cutting men in half, severing limbs with single blows, splitting shields and the men holding them, crushing helmets and the skulls beneath. A warrior wielding a 6-foot axe had enormous reach advantage. He could strike men before they could reach him with shorter weapons. The wide blade meant he didn't need pinpoint accuracy. A swing in the general direction of an enemy could still connect. The psychological impact of facing these weapons cannot be overstated. If you're a Pecheneg warrior, maybe in your 20s, who has fought tribal battles on the steppes, you've seen men killed with arrows, spears, swords, but you've probably never seen a man with an axe as tall as himself splitting other men like firewood. The terror this inspired is recorded in sources. The wagon wall broke, not in one place. The Varangians opened multiple breaches. Once the first wagons were smashed apart, the chains holding them together became liabilities rather than strengths. Pull one wagon aside, and the structural integrity of the entire circle weakened. regular Byzantine infantry poured through the gaps the Varangians had created. Now the Pecheneg advantages disappeared. Their mobility. Horse archers need room to maneuver. Inside a crowded camp, hemmed in by wagons and panicking civilians, that mobility was gone. Their lega. It had become a trap instead of a fortress. Their superior numbers. In close quarters combat, superior numbers only matter if you have room to bring them to bear. The Byzantine army swarmed into the Pecheneg camp. What followed was, in the clinical language of Byzantine chroniclers, a bloodbath. The wagon folk fell by the thousands, and their palisaded camps were seized as plunder. The captives were beyond number. This was not merely a military defeat. It was the destruction of an entire people's hope for survival as an independent nation. The Pechenegs inside the lega included warriors, yes, but also women, children, the elderly, entire families. The Byzantine troops, having suffered casualties from hours of arrow fire, showed limited mercy. The numbers are impossible to verify with precision. Ancient and medieval chroniclers regularly exaggerated, particularly regarding casualties. But what's clear from multiple sources is that the Battle of Beroia resulted in massive Pecheneg losses, tens of thousands killed, many more taken prisoner. The survivors faced a choice: submit to Byzantine authority and be enrolled in the imperial army, or die. Most chose survival. John Komnenos, following standard Byzantine practice, resettled many of the captured Pechenegs as military colonists in frontier regions. They would serve the empire that had defeated them. Their warrior skills would be redirected toward defending Byzantine borders. Within a generation, the Pecheneg language would begin disappearing. Within several generations, Pechenegs would cease to exist as a distinct ethnic group, absorbed into the larger populations of Byzantium, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The victory at Beroia had profound consequences. For the Pechenegs, as we've seen, it meant extinction as an independent people. For the Byzantine Empire, it secured the Balkan frontier for decades. John could redirect his attention and resources to campaigns in Anatolia against the Seljuk Turks. Knowing his European territories were stable, the victory enhanced John's reputation enormously. He had proven himself a capable military commander in only his 4th year as emperor. He established an annual feast day commemorating the victory, which Byzantine sources tell us was still celebrated nearly a century later. The chronicler Nikitas Choniets, writing in the late 12th century, confirms this feast was still observed, making Beroia as significant to Byzantium as Trafalgar would later be to Britain. For the Varangian Guard, Beroia solidified their reputation as the premier shock troops of the medieval world. They had justified their expensive salaries and privileges. They had proven that their unusual weapons and tactics weren't merely theatrical, but devastatingly effective. But let's step back and understand the deeper significance of what happened at Beroia. The Varangian Guard represented something unique in military history. A mercenary force from one culture, serving an empire from another culture, bringing with them weapons and tactics from their homeland, integrated into a completely different military system. This required trust on both sides. The Byzantines had to trust that these foreign warriors, who didn't speak Greek as their first language, who weren't Orthodox Christians by heritage, who came from lands so distant most Byzantines couldn't locate them, would actually fight for the emperor when it mattered. The Varangians had to trust that the Byzantines would pay them, support them, and use them in ways that gave them a chance to survive. This trust was built over generations. It was maintained by 3 factors. First, money. The Varangians received significantly higher pay than regular Byzantine troops. They had access to imperial ceremonies where gifts were distributed. Most famously, they had the traditional right to plunder the imperial treasury upon the death of an emperor. This last privilege, called the politron or donation, meant every Varangian had a vested financial interest in protecting the emperor during his life, and a lucrative benefit when that emperor died naturally. This created perfect alignment of incentives. Second, cultural factors. Both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons came from warrior cultures that emphasized oath-keeping. In Scandinavian and Germanic tradition, breaking an oath was among the most shameful acts possible. A warrior who swore to protect someone and then betrayed the oath would be ostracized, considered nithling, the lowest form of coward. The Varangians took their oaths to the emperor seriously, not primarily because they loved the Byzantine Empire, but because they valued their own honor. Third, practical considerations. These men were thousands of miles from home. They had no local power base, no local political connections. They couldn't conspire with Byzantine noble families to overthrow an emperor and install another because they weren't part of those networks. This isolation, which might seem like a weakness, was actually their greatest strength in the emperor's eyes. They could be trusted absolutely because they had nowhere else to turn. The emperor was their patron, their employer, their only source of security and wealth. This arrangement worked brilliantly for over 3 centuries, but it required the right situations to prove its worth. Beroia was one of those situations. The Varangian Guard's role at Beroia tells us something important about medieval warfare that's often misunderstood. Modern people, influenced by movies and video games, often imagine medieval battles as chaotic free-for-alls where warriors fought individual duels. The reality was far more organised. Medieval armies, particularly professional armies like Byzantium's, fought in formations. They used tactics. They had chains of command. Battles were won not by individual heroics, but by units executing coordinated manoeuvres at critical moments. The Varangian Guard was essentially a medieval special forces unit. They weren't deployed for routine duties. They were held in reserve for critical moments. At Beroia, that moment was the wagon lager. No other unit in the Byzantine army could have broken through that wooden wall as efficiently. Regular infantry with swords and spears, they would have been cut down by arrows before accomplishing anything. Cavalry, useless against a wagon fortress. Archers, the Byzantines had archers, but archery duels favour the side with better protection, and the pechenegs had the wagons. Only heavy infantry, heavily armoured, armed with weapons specifically designed to destroy wood, and wielded by men strong enough and skilled enough to do it under combat conditions. That's what the Varangian Guard provided. Let's also consider what this tells us about the evolution of warfare. The Danish axe was, in many ways, an outdated weapon by 1122. It had been most prominent during the Viking Age, roughly the 9th through 11th centuries. By the 12th century, the sword had become the preferred weapon of knights and nobles across Europe. The axe was associated with infantry, with commoners, with Vikings who were by this point largely converted to Christianity and integrated into European kingdoms. Yet here at Beroia, this supposedly outdated weapon proved decisive. Why? Because weapons don't have inherent value, they have contextual value. The Danish axe was perfect for breaking wagon walls. A sword, the noble weapon, would have been useless. This is a lesson military historians emphasise, but popular culture often ignores. Warfare isn't about having the best weapon in some abstract sense. It's about having the right weapon for the specific tactical situation you face. The Varangian Guard understood this. They maintained their traditional weapons not out of conservatism, but because those weapons were optimally suited to their tactical role. As heavy shock infantry whose job was to break enemy formations at critical moments, they needed weapons with massive striking power. The Danish axe provided exactly that. Let's talk about the human experience of this battle. What was it like to be a Varangian at Beroia? You're probably in your 20s or 30s. You've travelled thousands of miles from Scandinavia or England. You're wearing armour that weighs perhaps 50 pounds. It's spring, so the temperature is moderate, but you're still sweating under all that metal and padding. You've been marching for weeks, living on campaign rations. You've watched the preliminary battle from a distance, seen men fall to pecheneg arrows. Now the Emperor himself, wounded but still commanding, has called for your unit. You move forward in formation, shields raised, your 6-foot axe in hand. Arrows are falling around you. You hear them hitting shields, armour. You hear men grunting as arrows find gaps. Someone near you falls. You keep moving. You reach the wagon wall. This is what you trained for. You plant your feet, grip your axe with both hands, and swing. The blade bites into wood. The impact travels up the shaft into your arms, your shoulders. You pull the axe free and swing again. Wood splinters. You're barely aware of the pechenegs on the other side, desperately trying to stop you. You're focused entirely on the task, break the wood, create the breach. Behind you, Byzantine infantry are waiting to pour through the gap you're creating. Your arms are burning from the repeated swings. Each impact jars your entire body. But you keep swinging, because your oath binds you, because your companions are beside you doing the same, because your pride as a northern warrior demands it, because you're being paid a fortune to do exactly this. The wagon breaks, the chain snaps, you push through. Now it's close combat, men pressing against men. You switch your grip on the axe, holding it closer to the blade for better control in tight quarters. Every swing has to count. The battlefield is chaos, screaming, metal on metal, the smell of blood and sweat. You can't see the larger battle anymore. Your world has shrunk to the few feet around you. You don't know if you're winning or losing, you just keep fighting. Hours later, it's over. You're covered in blood, not all of it yours. You're exhausted. Your arms feel like dead weight. You have minor wounds you weren't even aware of receiving, but you're alive. And around you, your fellow Varangians are alive. You've done your job. The Emperor will reward you. Your reputation is enhanced. Tonight there will be looting of the Pecheneg camp, the spoils of victory. Tomorrow you'll march back toward Constantinople, probably stopping at your wounds, probably joking with your companions about near misses and lucky strikes, probably already thinking about how you'll spend your share of the plunder. This was the human reality of serving in the Varangian Guard. Not romantic, not particularly glorious in the moment, but effective and profitable. After Beroia, the Varangian Guard continued to serve Byzantine emperors for another 2 centuries. They would fight in numerous campaigns across the empire's territories. They would defend Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, though ultimately the city would fall to the Crusaders. That defeat marked the beginning of the Guard's decline. Without the wealth of an intact Byzantine empire to pay their salaries, recruitment declined. By the late 13th century, the Varangians were mostly ethnically assimilated into the Byzantine Greek population. The Guard remained in existence until at least the mid-14th century, and as late as 1400, some people in Constantinople still identified themselves as Varangians. But the great days were long past. What's remarkable is how long the institution lasted. From 988, when the first Rus warriors arrived, to at least the 1300s, over 3 centuries of continuous service. Few military units in history can claim such longevity. And throughout that entire period, one image remained constant: the axe-bearing barbarian, the pelekiphoroi, the Varangian with his Danish axe towering weapon in hand, ready to break enemy formations at the Emperor's command. The Battle of Beroia in 1122 wasn't the first time the Varangian Guard proved their worth. They had done so many times before. It wouldn't be their last, but it was perhaps the most complete demonstration of their value. A desperate situation, an enemy that couldn't be defeated by conventional means, a tactical problem that required a specific solution, and the Varangian Guard providing exactly that solution. Breaking through wagon walls with giant axes wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. It was brutal, direct, and overwhelmingly effective, which is exactly what the Byzantine Empire needed at that moment. Modern military theorists talk about force multipliers, elements that amplify the effectiveness of your forces beyond their raw numbers. The Varangian Guard was a force multiplier, not because they were superhuman, but because they provided capabilities that no other unit possessed. They could break fortifications that stopped regular infantry. They could hold defensive positions that cavalry couldn't maintain. They could execute attacks that required absolute discipline and cohesion, and they could be trusted completely in a political environment where trust was rare and precious. This is ultimately what made the Varangian Guard significant. Not just their weapons or their prowess, though both were impressive, but their reliability. An emperor surrounded by ambitious nobles, generals with armies, bureaucrats with their own agendas, foreign powers seeking advantage, could look at his Varangian Guard and know with certainty: these men will protect me. These men will fight when I need them. These men will not betray me. In a medieval world where betrayal was common, where emperors were regularly overthrown by their own commanders, where political loyalty was conditional and temporary, the Varangians offered something rare: unconditional military service in exchange for gold. No political ambitions, no dynastic claims, no complicated loyalties, just warriors doing what warriors do, for an employer who paid well. At Beroia in the spring of 1122, when the Byzantine army faced the Pecheneg wagon Lega, when the battle hung in the balance, when Emperor John Komnenos needed his ultimate weapon, he called for his Varangians, and they answered, with axes. Those axes hacked through wood, through chain, through the Pecheneg defensive position. They broke the deadlock. They won the battle. They saved the Byzantine frontier. They ended the Pechenegs as an independent people, not through cleverness or strategy or technology. Through the simple, brutal application of focused violence. A man with a 6-foot axe swinging with all his strength can break almost anything, including the hopes of an entire nation. The chronicler Nikitas Choniats, writing decades after Beroia, captured something essential about that moment. When he described John going forth with the Varangians like an unbreakable wall, he wasn't just describing physical movement, he was describing psychological impact. The Pechenegs behind their wagon fortress, who had felt safe, who had believed their traditional defences would hold, saw those northern giants approaching. They saw the axes. They understood, in that moment before contact, that their wagon wall was about to be destroyed. Fear broke them before the axes did. This is the power of elite units. Their reputation precedes them. The enemy knows what's coming and knows they can't stop it. Morale cracks. Discipline wavers. The battle is half won before the first blow is struck. The Varangian Guard at Beroia represented the culmination of over a century of development. Training, experience, tradition, reputation, all combined in one unit at one critical moment, and they performed exactly as designed. This is their legacy, not primarily as warriors, though they were certainly that, but as the ultimate expression of professional military service, men who fought not for patriotism or religion or revenge, but for gold and honour, who maintained their oath because their culture demanded it, who brought skills from one civilization to serve another, who remained effective for centuries by staying true to their core identity while adapting to their environment. When the battle ended, when the Pecheneg survivors were rounded up and enrolled in Byzantine service, when John Komnenos returned to Constantinople to celebrate his victory, the Varangian Guard marched with him, probably singing songs in languages the Greeks couldn't understand, probably richer by the plunder they had taken, probably already looking forward to their next campaign, their next battle, their next opportunity to prove their worth, because that's what they were, professional soldiers, the best heavy infantry in the medieval world, the Emperor's ultimate insurance policy, and on that spring day in 1122 at Beroia, when they hacked their way through Pechenegs' wagons with their giant Danish axes, they earned their reputation completely. The axe-bearing barbarians had spoken, and an entire people had ceased to exist. The aftermath of Beroia rippled across the medieval world in ways that extended far beyond the immediate military victory. News travelled slowly in the 12th century, but it travelled. Within months, courts across Europe and the Middle East knew that the Byzantine Empire had crushed the Pechenegs completely, that Emperor John Komnenos had personally led his army to victory, and that the decisive moment had involved foreign warriors with axes breaking through fortifications that should have been impregnable. This enhanced the mystique of the Varangian Guard considerably. They were already legendary among those who knew of them. Now their legend spread further. In the Norse sagas written in Iceland and Norway, tales of the Varangian Guard serving in Miklagard, the great city of Constantinople, had circulated for generations. Warriors who travelled east seeking fortune, who returned with Byzantine gold and stories of unimaginable wealth. After Beroia, those stories gained new details. The battle where the Varangians broke the wagon fortress, where northern axes proved superior to eastern defences, where men from the frozen lands showed the Mediterranean world how real warriors fought. In England, among the Anglo-Saxon diaspora scattered across Europe after the Norman conquest, Beroia became a point of pride. The Anglo-Saxons who had refused to submit to William the Conqueror, who had maintained their independence by travelling to Byzantium, had proven their worth. They hadn't merely survived in exile, they had thrived. They had become essential to one of the world's great empires. When Anglo-Saxon nobles heard that their kinsmen in the Varangian Guard had been instrumental in destroying the Pechenegs, it validated their choice to resist Norman rule. They hadn't abandoned their homeland out of cowardice. They had sought new opportunities where their warrior skills would be valued properly. The Norman chroniclers, by contrast, tended to downplay the Varangian role at Beroia. They had their own narrative to maintain, that the Norman conquest of England had been inevitable, that Anglo-Saxon military culture was inferior, that the future belonged to mounted knights in the Norman style. The success of Anglo-Saxon axemen in Byzantine service complicated that narrative, so Norman sources either ignored it or claimed that the Varangians were mostly Scandinavians now, not the English exiles who had fled after Hastings. But the men actually serving in the Guard knew the truth. The Anglo-Saxon component remained substantial throughout the 12th century. English was spoken in their barracks. Anglo-Saxon traditions were maintained. and the memory of England before the conquest remained alive among them. They were, in a sense, the last free Anglo-Saxons, not subjects of Norman kings, not peasants farming land for French-speaking lords, but warriors serving an emperor who valued them for their skills and paid them accordingly. This gave them a unique identity, neither fully Byzantine nor still English, something in between. Professional soldiers whose nationality mattered less than their unit cohesion and their oath to the emperor. The Varangian Guard after Beroia continued to evolve. New recruits arrived regularly from Scandinavia and from Norman-controlled England. The trickle of Anglo-Saxon exiles had slowed by the 1120s, but it hadn't stopped completely. Men still chose exile and Byzantine service over submission to Norman rule. These new recruits had to be integrated into an existing military culture. They had to learn Byzantine military drill and formations. They had to learn enough Greek to understand commands. They had to adapt their fighting styles to work within Byzantine combined arms tactics. But they also maintained continuity with the past. The veterans trained the newcomers. The traditions were passed down. The axes remained central to their identity. By the 1130s, a Varangian recruit arriving in Constantinople would join a unit with over a century of institutional memory. He would be taught by men who had fought at Beroia, who had been taught by men who had fought under Basil II, who maintained a direct link back to the original Rus warriors of 988. This kind of institutional continuity was rare in the medieval world. Most military units were temporary, raised for a campaign, disbanded afterward. Even professional armies often saw complete turnover within a generation. But the Varangian Guard endured, and with that endurance came accumulated expertise. They knew more about heavy infantry combat than any comparable unit. They had refined their tactics through countless engagements. They understood exactly how to maximize the effectiveness of their axes in different situations. Against cavalry, they formed tight shield walls that horses wouldn't charge. The axes gave them reach to strike riders or horses before contact. Against other infantry, they used their armour and weapons to create localized superiority, breaking enemy formations at chosen points. Against fortifications, as at Beroia, they became siege weapons themselves, hacking through obstacles that stalled other troops. This versatility made them invaluable. A military unit that can only do one thing has limited utility. But a unit that can adapt to multiple tactical situations becomes essential. The Varangian Guard filled multiple roles: palace guards protecting the emperor in Constantinople, shock troops breaking enemy lines in pitched battles, assault infantry storming fortifications, even intimidation, their presence sometimes enough to discourage potential threats. Emperor John Komnenos recognized their value and used them frequently. Throughout his 25-year reign, the Varangians accompanied him on numerous campaigns, into Anatolia against the Seljuk Turks, into Syria against the Crusader states and Muslim powers, into the Balkans against various threats. They became his military signature. When John appeared on a battlefield with his Varangian bodyguard, everyone knew the Empire's best troops were present. This created a feedback loop. The more they were used, the more experienced they became. The more experienced they became, the more valuable they were. The more valuable they were, the more they were used. By the 1140s, veterans of the Varangian Guard had combat experience across the full breadth of the Byzantine Empire's frontiers. Let's examine one specific example. In 1138, John Komnenos campaigned in Syria. The Crusader Principality of Antioch had grown powerful and troublesome. John decided to bring it to heel. He assembled a massive army and marched south. The campaign involved both sieges and field battles. At one point, John needed to storm a fortified city. Once again, he called on his Varangians. The scene was reminiscent of Beroia. Walls instead of wagons, but the principle was the same. Heavy infantry with axes assaulting defensive positions. The Varangians approached under covering fire from Byzantine archers. They reached the walls and began working on the gates. Medieval gates were reinforced with iron, designed to resist battering rams. But the Varangian axes bit into the wood between the iron bands. Hours of sustained effort, multiple warriors taking turns swinging. Gradually, systematically, they destroyed the gate. Byzantine forces poured through. The city fell. This became a pattern. When John needed something broken, he sent his Varangians. They were, in effect, human siege engines, less sophisticated than catapults or trebuchets, but more flexible and more precise. They could focus their efforts on specific weak points. They could adapt in real time to defensive countermeasures, and they could transition immediately to combat once the breach was created. The cost of maintaining the Varangian Guard was substantial. Their high salaries, their equipment which had to be the best available, their barracks in Constantinople, the administrative structure supporting them. Byzantine financial records from this period are incomplete, but we can make estimates. A regular Byzantine soldier might receive 5 to 10 gold coins annually. A Varangian probably received 20 to 30. With a guard strength of perhaps 500 to 1,000 men, that's 10,000 to 30,000 gold coins per year just in base salary. Then add equipment costs. A full suit of lamellar armour cost perhaps 50 gold coins. A quality Danish axe, properly forged and balanced, perhaps 5 to 10 coins. Shields, helmets, secondary weapons, all added up. Then food, housing, medical care, support staff. The total annual cost of the Varangian Guard probably exceeded 50,000 gold coins, a massive expense for any medieval state. Yet the Byzantine emperors paid it willingly, because the alternative was worse. What's the value of a loyal bodyguard when assassination is common? What's the value of elite shock troops that can win battles at critical moments? What's the value of having soldiers you can trust absolutely in a world of political treachery? The Varangians earned their pay, but beyond military effectiveness they served another crucial function. They were a symbol of imperial power, wealth, and reach. The Byzantine emperor could command warriors from the frozen north thousands of miles away who had chosen to serve him over their own local rulers. That demonstrated power in a way that Greek or Armenian soldiers couldn't. It showed that the empire's influence extended beyond its formal borders, that men from distant lands recognized Byzantine supremacy. This symbolic value shouldn't be underestimated. Medieval rulers understood the importance of display. Ceremonies, regalia, impressive bodyguards, all contributed to the aura of authority. When foreign ambassadors visited Constantinople and saw the Varangian Guard, towering warriors with their massive axes, standing absolutely still and disciplined, it sent a message. This empire is powerful. This emperor is protected by the best warriors in the world. This is not a state you want to challenge. The Varangians became part of the imperial theatre. During ceremonial occasions, they would perform coordinated movements with their axes, raising them in salute, striking them against shields in rhythm, creating impressive displays of discipline and coordination. These weren't spontaneous. They were carefully rehearsed. The Varangians trained for ceremonial duties as seriously as they trained for combat. Some modern historians have questioned whether the Varangians were as effective as Byzantine sources claim. They point out that Byzantine chroniclers had reason to exaggerate. Praising the emperor's bodyguard was a way of praising the emperor. Describing their victories in dramatic terms made for better narratives, and the chronicles were often written decades after events, when details could be embellished or misremembered. These are valid concerns. We should always approach medieval sources critically. But in the case of the Varangian Guard, multiple independent sources confirm their effectiveness. Not just Byzantine chronicles, but Norse sagas, Arab historians, and even later Western European sources. The consistency across different cultures and perspectives suggests the core truth is accurate. The Varangians were genuinely elite troops. Moreover, their continued employment for over 3 centuries argues for their effectiveness. If they had been merely ceremonial, if their reputation exceeded their reality, Byzantine emperors would have eventually stopped paying their expensive salaries. Medieval rulers were practical about military matters. They couldn't afford to waste resources on ineffective troops. The fact that the Guard endured for so long suggests they provided value commensurate with their cost. Let's return to the specific question of their weapons. Why did the Danish axe remain their primary weapon when military technology was evolving? By the 12th century, the crossbow was becoming increasingly important. Crossbows could penetrate armour that stopped arrows. They required less training than longbows. They were perfect for defenders on walls. Yet the Varangians didn't adopt crossbows. They stuck with their axes. Similarly, the sword was the prestige weapon of the medieval period. Knights across Europe carried swords as symbols of their status. Byzantine cavalry used swords. Even Byzantine infantry officers carried swords. The Varangians had swords as secondary weapons, but their primary weapon remained the axe. Why? Several reasons. First, specialization. The Varangian Guard wasn't trying to be a general-purpose unit. They had a specific tactical role, heavy assault infantry. For that role, the axe was optimal. A sword couldn't break through wooden fortifications. A crossbow couldn't create breaches in enemy formations. The axe could do both. Second, tradition and identity. The Varangians were defined by their axes. It was their signature. Abandoning the axe would have meant abandoning part of what made them Varangian. Military units with strong identities resist changes that threaten that identity. Third, institutional knowledge. They had accumulated over a century of experience in axe combat. Training methods, techniques, tactics, all built around the axe. Switching to different weapons would have meant losing that accumulated expertise. Fourth, the axe actually had advantages in close-quarters combat that other weapons lacked. The long handle provided leverage for pushing and grappling. The beard of the axe, the lower projection of the blade, could hook shields and pull them aside. The axe could be used as a staff weapon, striking with the haft as well as the blade, and the psychological impact remained significant. Men feared the axe in ways they didn't fear swords or spears. There's something primal about being struck with a massive blade that can split you in half. That fear gave the Varangians an edge before combat even began, so they kept their axes, and they kept winning, which validated their choice. Military conservatism gets criticised sometimes, but there's wisdom in not fixing what isn't broken. The Varangian Guard had found a combination of weapons, tactics, and identity that worked. They refined it. They perfected it. They didn't need to adopt every new military innovation because what they were doing was already highly effective. This kind of focused expertise is actually quite modern in concept. Today's special forces units train for specific missions. They don't try to be good at everything. They become excellent at particular tasks. The Varangians, 800 years earlier, understood this principle. Be the best at what you do. Don't try to do everything. Let's talk about recruitment in more detail. How did someone actually join the Varangian Guard? The process varied depending on the period and the recruit's origin. In the early days, around 988 to 1050, recruits came primarily from Rus territories. They travelled the river routes from Kiev or Novgorod to the Black Sea, then to Constantinople. These were often younger sons of noble families seeking fortune abroad, or warriors who had served in Scandinavian or Rus armies and wanted better opportunities, or men fleeing legal troubles, blood feuds, or political difficulties. The journey itself was arduous, thousands of miles through territories that weren't always friendly. River travel was dangerous. Portages required carrying boats and goods overland. Bandits and hostile tribes posed threats. Only the determined and capable made it to Constantinople. This meant the recruits who arrived were already selected for toughness and competence. Once in Constantinople, they had to present themselves to the Guard's officers. There would have been some vetting process. Could they actually fight? Did they have recommendations? Could they demonstrate their claimed skills? The Guard couldn't afford to accept anyone who showed up. They needed warriors who could maintain their standards. If accepted, a recruit would swear an oath to the emperor. This was serious business, not a casual promise but a binding commitment enforced by religious and cultural sanctions. The recruit promised to protect the emperor with his life, to obey orders, to maintain discipline, to uphold the Guard's reputation. In exchange, the emperor, through his representatives, promised to pay the recruit's salary, to provide equipment and support, to use the Guard honourably, to respect their traditions. This was essentially a contract. Both sides had obligations. Both sides had expectations. Violating the oath had consequences. For the recruit it meant expulsion, loss of salary and possibly worse. For the emperor it meant the Guard might refuse to serve, which would be politically disastrous, so both sides generally honoured their commitments. After swearing the oath, the recruit would begin training. Even experienced warriors needed to learn Byzantine military drill. The hand signals, the formation movements, the commands in Greek. They needed to integrate with their new comrades, learn who to trust, establish their place in the unit's hierarchy. This probably took months, maybe a year. During this time, the recruit would be evaluated constantly. Could he keep up on marches? Did he maintain his equipment? Did he perform well in training exercises? Did he follow orders promptly? The veterans would be watching, assessing whether this newcomer was worthy of being called Varangian. Eventually, if he proved himself, he would be fully accepted. He would receive the full pay and privileges. He would be trusted with important duties. He would be one of the emperor's chosen warriors. This process ensured quality control. The Varangian Guard maintained high standards because they could afford to be selective. Constantinople's wealth and the Guard's reputation meant they had more applicants than positions. They could reject anyone who didn't meet their requirements. By the late 11th century, after the Norman conquest of England, the recruitment pattern shifted. Now Anglo-Saxons arrived in significant numbers. These men faced a different situation. Many were nobles who had lost their lands. They weren't seeking fortune so much as refuge and a way to maintain their warrior status. They often arrived in organised groups rather than as individuals. Entire retinues of Anglo-Saxon warriors would travel together to Constantinople. This created cultural tensions within the Guard. The Scandinavians and Rus had similar cultural backgrounds. The Anglo-Saxons were different. They spoke a different language. They had different customs. They were Christians of longer standing. Initially, there may have been friction, but several factors eased integration. First, both groups were Germanic peoples with related languages. Old Norse and Old English were different, but had enough commonality that speakers could communicate. Second, both groups valued similar warrior virtues: courage, loyalty, martial skill. Third, both groups used similar weapons. The Danish axe was familiar to Anglo-Saxon warriors. The Huscarls who fought at Hastings had used similar axes. Fourth, they shared a common enemy: the Normans. Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons both had reason to resent Norman power. This created common ground. Over time, the Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian components blended. Intermarriage occurred, cultural practices merged, a hybrid Varangian identity emerged. No longer purely Scandinavian or purely Anglo-Saxon, but something new, a warrior culture that drew from both traditions but was ultimately Byzantine in context. This cultural evolution is fascinating. It shows how military units can develop their own distinct identities that transcend their original ethnic backgrounds. The Varangians of 1150 were different from the Varangians of 1000, but they maintained continuity through shared traditions and institutional memory. The Guard also occasionally recruited from other sources. There are records of Franks, Germans, and even a few Italians serving. These were exceptions, not the norm. The Varangian Guard remained primarily Northern European, but the willingness to accept exceptional warriors from other backgrounds shows pragmatism. If someone could meet the standards, prove their worth, and swear the oath, their specific origin mattered less than their capabilities. This meritocratic aspect was unusual for the medieval period. Most military units were ethnically homogeneous. Recruitment was based on geography or family connections. But the Varangian Guard, precisely because it was a mercenary unit, serving far from its members' homelands, developed a more open recruitment culture. You proved yourself through deeds, not bloodlines. Let's discuss their daily lives when not campaigning. The Varangian Guard was stationed in Constantinople, the greatest city in the medieval world. A metropolis of perhaps 400,000 people, the largest city in Europe, a centre of trade, learning and culture that made Western European cities look like villages by comparison. The Varangians lived in barracks near the Great Palace. They had better accommodations than regular soldiers, private rooms or small shared quarters rather than large dormitories, better food, access to the city's amenities. Constantinople offered everything: markets selling goods from across the known world, churches with magnificent mosaics and relics, public baths, a Roman tradition the Byzantines maintained, taverns and entertainment, the hippodrome where chariot races drew massive crowds. For warriors from Scandinavia or England, this was overwhelming. Villages they came from might have a few hundred people. Constantinople had hundreds of thousands. The wealth on display, the architecture, the complexity of urban life, all completely foreign. Many Varangians experienced culture shock. The sources hint at this. Norse sagas describe warriors being amazed by the city's grandeur. Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention the wealth and sophistication. These weren't naive peasants. These were experienced warriors who had seen their share of the world. Yet Constantinople impressed them deeply. The Varangians had to adapt to Mediterranean urban life. The climate was warmer than they were accustomed to. The food was different. The social customs were foreign. Greeks bathed regularly, which Northern Europeans found strange. Greeks ate differently, using more spices, more vegetables, less meat. Greeks spoke constantly with their hands, which seemed excessive to Northerners. Greeks argued loudly about theological minutiae. which seemed pointless to men more concerned with practical matters. Yet the Varangians adapted. They learned Greek, at least enough for daily needs. They developed tastes for Mediterranean food and wine. They formed relationships with local women. Many married and had children who grew up speaking Greek, identifying as Byzantine, but maintaining some connection to their father's heritage. This created a diaspora community. Northern Europeans in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, maintaining their distinct identity while participating in Byzantine life. They had their own churches, probably following slightly different liturgical practices. They had their own social networks. They sent money back home, supporting relatives in Scandinavia or England. They maintained trading connections, facilitating commerce between Byzantium and the north. In this sense, the Varangian Guard served as a bridge between civilizations, not just militarily, but culturally and economically. Their religious life deserves attention. The Varangians were Christians, but their Christianity differed from Byzantine orthodoxy in some respects. Scandinavians had converted relatively recently, within the past century or two. Their Christianity retained elements of older pagan traditions. Anglo-Saxons were longer Christianized but followed Western liturgical practices that differed from Eastern Orthodoxy. The Great Schism between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy occurred in 1054. This created theological and political complications. Were the Varangians Orthodox or Catholic? The answer seems to be pragmatic. They attended Orthodox services while in Constantinople. They received Orthodox sacraments. But they probably maintained some Western practices in private. The Byzantine authorities seem to have been tolerant. As long as the Varangians fulfilled their military duties and didn't cause problems, their exact theological positions weren't scrutinized too carefully. This pragmatic tolerance was typical of Byzantium at its best, a cosmopolitan empire that could accommodate different Christian traditions. Religious diversity within Christianity was acceptable, as long as everyone agreed on the basic creed and acknowledged the emperor's authority. The Varangians fit within this framework. They were Christians. They served the Christian emperor. The details could be overlooked. Their economic impact on Constantinople was significant. 500 to 1,000 well-paid warriors spending their salaries in the city. They rented housing, bought food and drink, purchased goods to send home, hired services. This generated substantial economic activity. Certain neighbourhoods in Constantinople probably catered specifically to Varangian clientele. Taverns where Norse and English were spoken, merchants who specialised in northern goods, women who worked as servants or companions for Varangian households. An entire microeconomy built around serving the guard's needs. When Varangians completed their service and returned home, they brought Byzantine wealth with them. Gold coins that would never have reached Scandinavia otherwise. Luxury goods, silks and spices and jewellery. This wealth redistribution had effects far beyond Byzantium. It stimulated northern European economies. It funded churches and monasteries built by returning veterans. It financed trade expeditions and military campaigns. The Varangian Guard served as a mechanism for transferring Byzantine wealth northward, which had long-term economic and cultural consequences. Some Varangians never returned home. They died in service, in battle, or from disease. They were buried in Constantinople far from their birthplaces. Some graves have been found, marked with runic inscriptions identifying the deceased as a warrior from the north. These graves are poignant reminders. Men who travelled thousands of miles to serve a foreign emperor, who died far from home, who were buried according to Christian rites in a Greek-speaking city, but whose gravestones proclaimed their northern identity. They remained Varangians to the end. Others retired in Constantinople or elsewhere in the empire. They took their accumulated wealth and bought land, became farmers or merchants, married local women. Their children would be Byzantine, speaking Greek, but carrying northern names and maintaining family memories of their father's service in the Guard. This created a scattered population of Byzantine citizens with Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon ancestry, fully integrated into Byzantine society but aware of their distinct origins. The economic aspect of service cannot be overemphasized. These men were professionals. They fought for pay. The glory was secondary. The adventure was a bonus. But the primary motivation was wealth. This doesn't diminish their courage or skill. Professional soldiers can be just as brave and capable as those fighting for ideological reasons. Sometimes more so because they've made a rational calculation that their skills are worth the risks. The Varangian Guard represented a very modern concept, skilled specialists selling their expertise to the highest bidder. In this case, The Byzantine emperor was the highest bidder. He could afford to pay for the best, and he did. This economic relationship created stability. As long as the emperor paid, the Varangians fought. As long as the Varangians fought well, the emperor paid. Both sides benefited. Both sides honoured the arrangement. This is why the Guard endured for so long. Let's examine what happened to the Guard after John Komnenos. His son Manuel succeeded him in 1143. Manuel was even more aggressive militarily than his father. He campaigned constantly, in Anatolia, in the Balkans, in Italy. The Varangian Guard accompanied him on all these campaigns. They continued their role as elite shock troops and imperial bodyguards. Under Manuel, the Guard may have reached its peak of effectiveness. He used them extensively, valued them highly, and maintained their privileges. Manuel's reign lasted until 1180, nearly 40 years of active campaigning. The Varangians who served under him became probably the most experienced heavy infantry in the world. Battle-hardened across dozens of engagements, experts in their craft. After Manuel died, the empire began its long decline. Internal political struggles weakened central authority. Military funding decreased. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 was catastrophic. Latin crusaders, supposed allies, besieged and conquered Constantinople. They sacked the city with appalling thoroughness, looted churches and palaces, destroyed priceless art and manuscripts, divided the empire among themselves. The Varangian Guard defended the city during the siege. They fought bravely, but they couldn't stop the inevitable. Constantinople fell. The Byzantine Empire fragmented into competing Greek successor states. The Varangians were scattered. Some may have fled to Nicaea, where one Byzantine successor state established itself. Some probably died in the fighting. Some may have simply dispersed, taking their weapons and seeking employment elsewhere. When the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople in 1261, they re-established the empire, but it was a shadow of its former self, smaller, poorer, weaker. The Varangian Guard was reconstituted, but it never regained its former strength. Recruitment from Scandinavia had largely ceased. The Anglo-Saxon exiles were long gone, their grandchildren now assimilated Byzantines. The later Varangian Guard was mostly ethnically Greek, maintaining the name and some traditions but lacking the distinct Northern European character that had defined the original Guard. By 1300, the Varangian Guard existed primarily as a ceremonial unit. They still performed palace duties, they still participated in imperial ceremonies, but their military effectiveness had diminished. The Byzantine Empire itself was a fading power, squeezed between the Ottoman Turks to the east and various Western European threats to the west. The Guard's final mentions in historical records come from the early 1400s. By 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks, the Varangian Guard had probably ceased to exist as a distinct unit. The institution that had endured for over 4 centuries finally ended, along with the empire it served. But the memory persisted. In Scandinavian sagas and chronicles written over the following centuries, in Byzantine historical works that described past glories, in the archaeological record, grave markers and artifacts showing the northern European presence in Constantinople, and in the broader historical narrative, as an example of an elite military unit that shaped medieval warfare. What lessons can we draw from the Varangian Guard's history? First, the power of professionalism. Amateur soldiers fighting part-time can rarely match, professionals who dedicate their lives to warfare. The Varangians trained constantly, maintained high standards, and accumulated experience over years or decades. This made them vastly more effective than militia or feudal levies. Second, the importance of trust in military relationships. The Byzantine emperors could trust the Varangians completely because their interests aligned. The Varangians had no reason to betray the emperor. This trust allowed the emperors to employ them in the most critical situations, confident they would perform as needed. Third, the value of specialized capabilities. The Varangians weren't trying to do everything. They focused on heavy assault infantry combat, and they became the best at it. This specialization made them irreplaceable. Fourth, the role of economic incentives. Paying soldiers well attracts quality recruits and ensures loyalty. The Byzantine willingness to pay high salaries for the Varangian Guard was a sound investment. The Guard's military effectiveness more than justified their cost. Fifth, the importance of institutional continuity. Organizations that maintain traditions, training methods, and institutional memory across generations become increasingly effective. The Varangian Guard benefited enormously from over a century of accumulated expertise by the time of Beroia. Sixth, cultural identity matters. The Varangians maintained their distinct Northern European identity even while serving in the Mediterranean. This identity gave them cohesion and pride. It made them more than just another military unit. They were the axe-bearing barbarians, and they cultivated that reputation. Seventh, adaptation within tradition is possible. The Varangians adapted to Byzantine military systems and tactics while maintaining their core identity and weapons. They showed that you can integrate into a larger organization without losing what makes you distinctive. These lessons remain relevant today. Modern military forces still grapple with the same issues: how to maintain elite units, how to build trust and cohesion, how to balance specialization with versatility, how to sustain institutional knowledge across generations. The Varangian Guard, 8 centuries ago, found solutions that worked. Their success over such a long period proves the soundness of their approach. The Battle of Beroia in 1122 was one moment in this long history, but it was an important moment. It demonstrated everything the Varangian Guard represented: courage, effectiveness, professionalism, and the power of the right weapon in the right hands at the right time. Those giant axes hacking through Pecheneg wagons symbolize the Guard's entire purpose: to break what needs breaking, to do what others cannot, to serve their oath faithfully, regardless of the cost. When we remember the Varangian Guard today, we should remember them as complete warriors, not just strong men with axes, though they were certainly that, but as professionals who chose their path deliberately, who travelled vast distances seeking opportunity, who maintained their honour and traditions in foreign lands, who proved their worth repeatedly over centuries, who served emperors faithfully, asking only fair payment in return, who created an institution that endured longer than most medieval kingdoms. The young Byzantine Empire that hired those first 6,000 Rus warriors in 988 couldn't have imagined what they were creating: a military unit that would serve for over 400 years, that would fight from Italy to Syria, from the Balkans to Anatolia, that would defend Constantinople in its greatest crises, that would become legendary across 3 continents, all because someone recognized that warriors from the frozen north, armed with their traditional weapons, trained in their traditional ways, could provide capabilities that no native Byzantine unit possessed. That recognition, and the willingness to pay for it, created one of history's most remarkable military institutions. The last Varangian to serve in Constantinople, sometime in the early 1400s, couldn't have known he was the last. He probably trained and served like all his predecessors, maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries. When he died or retired, the chain was finally broken. No new recruits arrived. No one carried on the traditions. The Varangian Guard ended, not dramatically but quietly, fading into history as the empire itself faded. But what they accomplished remains. At Beroia and dozens of other battlefields, in the palaces they guarded, in the emperors they protected, in the enemies they defeated, in the reputation they built and maintained across generations, in the story they created of northern warriors serving in the greatest city of the medieval world, carrying their giant axes into battles that shaped history. That story resonates today because it combines elements we find compelling: exotic warriors from distant lands, distinctive weapons and tactics, loyalty and professionalism, success against overwhelming odds, cultural collision and adaptation, and at its heart the image of those axemen at Beroia, methodically destroying the Pecheneg wagons, opening the breach that would win the battle and destroy a nation. The thunder of axes against wood, the splintering of defences, the cry of warriors pushing through, the moment when elite troops justified every gold coin they'd ever been paid, the moment when the Varangian Guard proved, once again, that they were worth their weight in Byzantine gold, that they were the emperor's ultimate weapon, that they were, quite simply, the best heavy infantry the medieval world had ever seen. When the last wagon broke, when the Varangians poured through the gap, when the battle turned decisively in Byzantium's favour, everyone present understood. The Guard had done it again. They had been given an impossible task and accomplished it, with their axes, with their discipline, with their courage, with everything that made them Varangian. The Battle of Beroia ended with Byzantine victory, The Pecheneг threat eliminated, Emperor John triumphant, and the Varangian Guard standing bloodied but unbroken, their axes red with the work they'd been paid to do, ready for the next battle, the next crisis, the next moment when the Emperor would need his northern warriors to break what needed breaking. Because that's what they were, what they had always been, what they would remain until the Empire itself fell, the axe-bearing guardians of Byzantium, the Varangians, and their legend endures,